Welcome to Car Nitty. My name is Mizan, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the expansion of ULEZ on the 25th of October 2021. That's been in the pipeline for 3 years. That's how long it was introduced, and finally it's going to be implemented, and I'm going to be talking to you about the effects of it on people, residents, just general stuff. As a prop car, I'm going to be driving this. It's an Audi A6 TDI 2-litre Ultra. All right, the Ultra is very important here. This is a 2014 car. Now, in normal circumstances, this would not be compliant because it's a 2014 car. Euro 6 standards, which I'm going to talk about later, were not mandatory. Now, this car is the Ultra, as I mentioned, which meant that Audi put new technology in this car, meaning it's actually compliant with ULEZ, all because it takes this secret potion. And I'm going to go into that a bit more later as well. Let's get in the car and we'll start talking about all this in a bit more detail. I apologize for the state of the car because this car has been lent to me by my brother. All right, so this is his car. Massive thank you to him for lending me this car for this video. First thing I want to mention is also the fact that this is not just a normal A6. It's not even an S-Line, it's a black edition, which I'm sure some of you can tell by the alloys and the de-chromed grille and whatnot. So let's start off by talking about what the Euros are. I mentioned Euro 6 and whatnot. So Euros are a bunch of regulations at the time given to manufacturers that they need to meet in regards to emissions and whatnot. So for example, a Euro 4 car will have a limit on the amount of nitrogen oxide it can produce and carbon dioxide, and every time a new Euro comes out it gets more and more stringent, more stricter. All right, so for example, Euro 4 is less imposing as Euro 5, and Euro 6 is the harshest one that we've got so far, and that's the one currently in place. When I mention all of this, Euro 6 is very key because Euro 6 is the minimum requirement. Well, I say minimum, it's the only requirement at this moment in time because Euro 7 is not out yet, but Euro 6 is what is required to drive a diesel within the ULEZ zone. Euro 6 was implemented in 2015, so that's when it became mandatory. All right, so Euro 6 was something that all manufacturers had to adhere to from 2015. That's why even if you check if your car is ULEZ compliant, it will say you need to have around a 2015 or newer car. But some cars such as this is older than 2015, but it meets the requirement, doesn't it? In terms of petrol cars, you need to have a Euro 4 petrol. Euro 4 was implemented in 2006, but again, as I mentioned, a lot of people were using it prior to that. A lot of people were using Euro 4 even 2005, 4, 3, so that's not as imposing as the diesel side of the story. With Euro 6 diesels, I find it crazy how cars need to take this secret potion called AdBlue in order to function. Literally, the car cannot function without AdBlue. Just think about how hard engineers and manufacturers are working to make these cars run on these tight emissions, that they need to take this weird fluid next to the diesel tank to be able to be compliant. It's a crazy thing when you think about it, isn't it? Then along with all of that, you get this thing called a NOx sensor, NOx, NOx sensor. On these diesel cars that have NOx sensors, if they go wrong, they're very, very pricey to replace. Very, very pricey. And as an owner, there is no effect on you whatsoever. It does nothing for your driving experience. So when it goes wrong and it needs to be replaced, it is a massive bill, massive. And it's unfortunate that it does nothing for you, and yet you have to fork out the money for it. And all they do is monitor the amount of NOx your car is emitting. And if you are producing more because of a problem with your car, a problem with your engine, whatever, the car will obviously warn you, advise you to take it into a workshop. If you do not do it after a certain amount of miles, the car will shut down on you. All right, you will be trying to drive and you won't be able to. It will just basically go in limp mode and shut itself down on the side of the road. It will not care. For example, it might have a 20 mile limit. Once that light comes on your dashboard, you got 20 miles to deal with it. Get to a garage, get it sorted, and then it will just shut down on you and you'll be stranded on the side of the road. That's the measures that are in place about NOx levels and NOx sensors. It's very, very draconian, and I must say, I don't know what is in AdBlue, but it might as well be magic beans at this rate, because I don't know how manufacturers do it. I've not got a lot to say about the Euro 4 petrol side of it, if I'm honest with you. It's pretty clear what the requirements are, and how it goes around it. So now let's talk about the zone of ULEZ, because it starts off with central London, right? And central London, I'll admit, all day long there needs to be restrictions. When there wasn't a congestion charge, London used to be manic. Everyone used to drive through the city centre. With congestion charge, people go around the city, and only those that really need to go through the city will go through it because they're willing to pay the charge. Now that's all good and well, and ULEZ came about. They implemented it within the city of London, and that not city of London, sorry, central London, and that's fine, because the way I see it is, again, those that are driving in central London, they should be driving clean cars. Yeah, it's fine, it's not a problem, because it's such a densely populated area with people walking that, you know what, we don't need these diesel smoking out black fumes everywhere, so that's fine. But the problem with ULEZ is the expansion of it. It's going to affect inner London boroughs. Now what they mean by that is you live inside the dual carriageway within London, which is the A6. So if you live within those two roads, you got the M25 around London, then you got the North Circular and South Circular roads. If you live between those two zones, you're falling inside of ULEZ, and that's the problem, because a lot of people that live in these zones aren't actually well off. They're working class people that earn to get by in life, and they're now being told that they need to be driving a 2015 or newer diesel car to meet those standards, and that might not be financially viable for them, because a 2015 car is only 6 years old at this moment in time, which means it may be too expensive for them to own and run. Now you can argue they can drive a 2006 petrol car or something like that and get on with it, but those cars sip fuel like you're running an open bar. They will honestly kill you on fuel. So some people genuinely do need a diesel for their commute or whatever, but they can't afford a Euro 6 diesel car. So what are you doing? You're penalizing them, aren't you? And it almost comes into a social class issue, which it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have to come down to that, but it does. A rich person would not even own a car older than 3 years unless it was a car that they really gelled with, or it was a performance car, classic, whatever. They'd have to have a reason for owning it for more than X amount of years. They don't really touch anything older than a certain amount, right? The average Joe relies on the second-hand market for their vehicles, because they can't always have the latest cars. A lot of people have made massive losses because of ULEZ as well. So a lot of people in my own family, the values of the car plummeted by 20 to 30% overnight the moment ULEZ was announced. And the other thing as well is the price of electric cars is ridiculous right now in the UK because of the price of batteries and production. So it's not the manufacturer's fault that they're so expensive, but let's be honest here, it is expensive to buy an electric car. Not everyone can do it. On top of that, the charging infrastructure is not here in the UK. So it just begs the question, how are people meant to get by in London? Even if you live outside of inner London boroughs, you're not even allowed to come in without paying a ridiculous fee. If everyone in the country went out and bought an electric car, this country would be in a crisis, because there wouldn't be enough electricity to charge these damn cars. I mean, the other week we had the fuel crisis issue, didn't we? And what happened? People were queuing up to buy petrol when they didn't need it. People that fill up £10 a week were queuing up for full tanks, and it caused a shortage. They want us to get electric cars, but at the same time, if everyone listened to them and rushed out, we'd be in a massive crisis. You just can't win with these people. You really, really can't. Just because BP had a shortage of drivers, people queued up and created a fuel crisis. Literally, there was no fuel crisis. BP were just short on a few drivers, and that caused everyone to run out and panic buy fuel, which then caused an actual fuel crisis when there wasn't one to begin with. And that just sums it up. If everyone goes out and buys an electric car, we're all going to be in trouble, because we're going to run out of electricity in the national grid. There's no way around it. Let's not forget, the Labour government in the mid-2000s are the ones that promoted diesel cars. They said, hey, diesels are better than petrol cars. Everyone should go and buy a diesel car. And guess what happened? People did buy it, and manufacturers were encouraging you making diesel cars. Do this next time you're going out somewhere. Play punch buggy, but instead of punching when you see bright colored cars, do this. Compare the number of diesels you see versus petrols and see what happens. For example, 320D versus 320i. I'm letting you know right now, I do not want to be the guy banking on the 320i's, because the guy that's got the petrol car, he's going to go home with a bruised arm. I'll tell you that right now. So how did they go from encouraging diesel cars to then turning so against it that people are making these monumental losses? You cannot make it up. The way they went from A to Z is unbelievable. There was no easing of it. Now, I'm not against ULEZ. I know there's a problem and there needs to be a solution, but the way they've gone about it is not it. I am honestly surprised that Sadiq Khan is still the mayor of London after the recent election. I mean, I know he lost some seats, but even then I am surprised, because he made a lot of people upset with the way he went around ULEZ. If you own a diesel, it's almost as if the government's saying you want kids to get cancer, you want kids to have asthma. That's basically what they're saying if you own one. This obviously links very closely to the VW scandal that happened in 2015. Now, if you don't know about that, what happened was that some VW engineers were struggling to meet the standards of diesel cars, you know, the Euros, as I mentioned. And in order to be able to meet it, what they did was they started cheating. So via the use of software, the cars themselves would say that they're emitting this much pollutants, when in reality that was not the case. So they were cheating. Now, you have to ask yourself, what they did there was very, very naughty. 100%. VW were not right to do that. At the same time, can you blame them? Can you blame them? These guys are forced into meeting these numbers and figures that just were unfair, to say the least, weren't they? They were just unfair. It's a bit like being in school and you've got a maths teacher, and that maths teacher doesn't know anything about maths, and they're telling you to do your homework. And if you don't know how to do it, let's be honest here, you're just gonna scribble some numbers and say, I'm done, miss, and hope they don't realize. And that's exactly what they did. London is the only place in the country that has the ultra low emission zone. Now, there are other standards, I don't know what to even call it, zones, such as clean air zone and ULEZ, which is low emission zone. But London's the only city with ULEZ at this moment in time. So you're basically saying people in London can afford the hit of ULEZ, selling their cars, taking their loss on it in the second-hand market, and vice versa. And again, it falls into the social class, doesn't it? Now, none of these are strict as ULEZ. That's the main factor here. That's something that's really worth knowing. And it's making London, which is already an expensive city to live in, just that little bit more expensive. Some of those zones I mentioned, like the clean air zone, in some cities they only apply to buses and coaches. I mean, it's astonishing. It's honestly astonishing. And then on top of that, a 1997 Mark III Golf Cabriolet petrol, so 1997, which is going to be a Euro 3 petrol engine, that meets ULEZ, low emission zone. How on earth does a car like that meet the emissions of the ULEZ standard? That's not even a ULEZ, if you ask me. That's not even an EZ, okay? It's not even an emission zone. You may as well be smoking diesel with a shisha pipe. The topic of clean air zone and ULEZ is too big of a subject to cover in this video. Maybe in a future video I'll cover it, maybe not. I feel really sad that we won't see cars that aren't technically classics, but they're no longer fit for the roads of London. Stuff like the E36 M3 Evo. It's the least loved M3. It doesn't meet ULEZ, and nor is it a classic. So does that mean they're no longer fit for our roads? It feels like a crime to even say it's unroadworthy, isn't it? What about stuff like Nissan Skyline R34 GTRs? I mean, are they old enough to be a classic? But they have a cult following. So what determines what a classic is? They're looking at purely from an age perspective, I believe, and the number of quantities that are out there. So it just doesn't make sense. They've given people absolutely no leeway here when it comes to ULEZ, none at all. There's so many nice cars that are old and classic, but who's to say what is a classic? It's all so subjective. I'm not saying I have all the answers here. I'm really not. But I think scrapping hundreds of thousands of cars, saying that they're no longer fit for the streets of London, is not the solution either. Those cars have a climate impact when they were being built, and some of them are not even 10 years old, and you're essentially saying that they're no longer fit for the streets of London. So where do they go? Essentially in the bin. People change their cars every 3 years or so, especially with lease and financing being so accessible. And if you ask me, that's the real problem here. People don't own their cars for long enough, and a 30-year-old BMW petrol or even a diesel has paid its economic debt to the world. It's paid it. What I think is a better solution is electrifying these cars. Maybe have subsidized the ability for people to have these cars with electric batteries. And definitely they need to allow people to make applications for classic cars, because who can say what is a classic and who's not? I had a Mark IV GTI on the channel. He had that car for 12 years, a Mark IV GTI. It's not a classic. It's not old enough. It's 21 years old. But saying that, the guy owned it for 12 years. He spent a lot of time and effort and money into that car, and he's recently sold it, by the way. But if it wasn't for ULEZ, he would have kept it forever. And Why was he not allowed to make an application and show that he's had the car for so long, the car has sentimental meaning to him, you name it? I mean, not everyone sees a car as a big box on wheels. Not everyone. There are people out there that have attachments to these things. Maybe they should charge people based on mileage or something, you know? The daily flat fee of £12.50 a day is too much. It's just way too much for someone to be paying. I think something based on mileage, or maybe even discounted ULEZ charges for residents. Anything would be better with the way they've gone around ULEZ. Anything. What they've essentially done is one glove fits all. Here's ULEZ, live with it, we don't care. You take your losses, we don't care. That's literally what they've done with ULEZ. There's a lot more I could say about ULEZ, but I feel like the video will be too long for that. I hope you've enjoyed my rant and my explanation on ULEZ and the surrounding topics. If you've got any thoughts, please do comment them down below. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you soon for the next one. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.